I want to be a writer when I grow up. What was there one event in your life that kind of inspired you that made you come to that epiphany that like hey, this is what I want to do for a living? Because I know I have that, and if we have time, I'll get to that. But I want to hear from you first, given how long you've been in this business. What one event, if there is one, gave you that kind of like inspiration to want to do this for a living?
Not only was there a passion very early, I was probably reading the paper when I was 5 and listening again always to the news and sports reports. So current events and what was going on in the world were powerfully exciting for me. But I think what made me believe that I could maybe write on a professional level was in 7th grade, and I had a tremendous nun, Sister Margaret, at my school, and she not only coached me and pushed me in our writing assignments, but I began to see that perhaps I could end up writing sentences that could hold up. And next thing you know, again, you get into high school and you see that it kind of is your vocation. I got on the paper, and it was a good high school paper, it really was, a weekly. I got on that as a junior, and that was as early as you could get on the staff. Next year I was the editor. Then I got to Lansing Community College and was fortunate to be named sports editor right off the bat. And I was sports editor there 2 years, and I transferred to Michigan State. And I, again, was lucky to get on the state news staff up there. A tremendous daily paper. I mean, really a good one. One of the best in the nation. A professional newspaper in every respect. And then I became sports editor my senior year. So it just built. But I think, Louis, it's a good question. Probably would go back to 7th grade when I began to understand that I could write sufficiently perhaps to pull this off. And it's not something that you do quickly or overnight. It takes all kinds of practice and pain and growth and so forth. Some guys are really naturally talented and right out of the chute, they can kind of dazzle. But I think for most people,
you have to hone it. It's a craft.
Yeah, exactly. As Peter King says from Sports Illustrated, it's like woodworking or any craft. You have to do it every day. And suddenly you begin to improve. And I think one thing I wish I would have had more of early on was the kind of coaching that Joe Falls later gave me. And he would critique some of the things I did, and I would see stuff that I had not seen before in terms of bad habits, good habits, whatever. And that was really, really enlightening. I probably was, if you look at me as an athlete, I was probably a guy with some raw talent, but I needed a lot of coaching and development. And with that, if the team would hang with me, I could be a contributor. I think that's kind of the way it was in this career. But it really evolved. But it evolves only if you have passion to match just a modicum of ability. I think essentially average ability can equip you to do it if you have passion, particularly to report. Reporting is so important. It's the essential underpinning of the job, and reporting for me, for newspaper journalism, was always more important and always more respected than the guys who could, let's say, do a lot of finesse with their writing.
And I think you make an interesting point there when you discuss reporting, because I've always heard it said, and I never really understand. I mean, we see it in some sports where athletes just aren't necessarily fans of interacting with the media, but what I don't think they understand is that before we had the advents of the internet and the fact that we could, now dial up, statistics or player names and rosters within, hundredths of a second nowadays, sports writers are what built the reputation of these sports. I mean, baseball, my passion, my sport, is attributed to an English guy, Henry Chadwick, who was first, who developed the box score in the late 1850s. He was, if it weren't for him, we wouldn't have, we wouldn't have the likes of, say, Shirley Povich or, say what you want about what his son does nowadays, but you wouldn't have the likes of, Shirley Povich or the broadcasters of Red Barber, Mel Allen, and Ernie Harwell, to reference a local Detroiter for you guys. I mean, you can even translate that over to, music. You wouldn't have the likes of, say, a Lester Bangs or a Robert Christgau, those guys who are just heralded in their field. But the important thing of what they did is they helped inform us about what was not only important, but what makes these sports so great. And, the reflections of, communal culture and, why, fans in Milwaukee are different from fans in Detroit, vice versa, New York, Toronto, etc. But what these, people did is they are the reason that these sports are relevant nowadays. So I think we all owe a debt to those who came before us. And
it's a very important point, and I agree with you, of course. Sometimes now, after I've called up Baseball Reference to get all of the statistics I need on a certain guy, I have to remind myself that the resource that we used to use back then was the Baseball Encyclopedia.
Yeah,
but it only gave you the stuff up until the year that you got in the newest edition. I believe
it was published in 1969 is the edition that a lot of sports writers up until the early 80s reference when they're doing.
It was amazing, and that's all you had. And otherwise, if the team didn't keep meticulous statistics, there really wasn't a great repository for those things. And I'm continually astounded that we were able to function the way we did for so long without the internet, because clearly we depend on it every minute, just about of every day, and particularly for research.
It was the air and the oxygen for what you guys did back in the day. And I mean,
that's right.
And in regards to history, I guess that leads me to another question that me and Scott kind of prepared before this. And, he had briefed me and, we reiterated that you've been doing this for, parts of 5 decades now. In your 45 years of covering sports, and I'm sure you've done a myriad of them, is there one event in particular, and you could pick multiple, but is there one in, say, a respective sport that means the most to you that you've been able to be a part of, even if it was, just writing a story on it during the course of your career?
There actually is an answer to that, and I was fortunate when I retired in February. They had me do a column kind of on my 45 years. Well, believe it or not, it went 9,000 words, which is, as we know, about 6 times the size of even a big story for the newspaper. Thankfully, they were able to take a portion of it for the paper and then run the rest on the website. But I needed 9,000 words to just give a summation of really about 15 big moments over 45 years. That's only one every 3 years, and there were obviously a lot more than that. But the number one event I had to choose was the near-perfect game by Armando Galarraga.
Yeah, 2009.
Yeah, that was blown by Jim Joyce at first base, umping before replay. And it brought in so many elements of drama and tragedy and personal gallantry and honor and all of the elements that you would, again, expect to become part of a masterpiece. And they were all present that night. And I was on hand for it, including the epic drama afterward in the umpire's clubhouse, where Jim Joyce was just simply emotionally distraught. And he was as close to emotional collapse, I think, as I've ever seen anyone in sports. He was that upset with himself for having blundered and cost Armando Galarraga a perfect game. He was ready to. It was clearly a very, very, very perilous moment for this guy. It really was.
I still have the voice of Rod Allen, former longtime Tigers broadcaster, when they replayed that on TV, and him uttering the words "Jim Joyce, no," almost as if he's breaking down in tears, because we know Galarraga didn't have a celebrated career. You can say that about Philip Humber, who threw a perfect game against the Mariners 3 years later. Jason Michaels' foot wasn't on the bag in time. Cabrera, flipped the ball to Galarraga, and he was there, but Joyce made that blunder. And I'll never forget the next day when ESPN played the highlights of Joyce handing the lineout cards out with Galarraga. He's in tears and he's patting him on the chest. And Galarraga, as humble a guy as he was, despite his shortcomings, he took it in stride. And I'll never forget that moment. I mean, there's a myriad of moments in Detroit history you can reference, but that one I love because not only was it so, I guess, personal to me because the idea of following a no-hitter as a kid, even before I had aspirations of covering the sport, was special. You got to tune in to networks that wouldn't normally air those games, and you get to maybe witness history.
Well, there was another part to that too, which really, again, for me, made it as exceptional as it was, and that is after seeing this meltdown by Joyce in the umpire's clubhouse, where he was just in pieces. I went back to the Tigers clubhouse because I was going to continue to converse with whoever was around there, and it turns out Jim Leland was still in his manager's office. And I went in there, and I happened to mention, I said, Joyce is just in shambles right now. He is really broken up. And Leland hollered to the press assistant there, Brian Britton. He said, let's get down there. And Jim knew he had to calm this guy down. Well, he went in there, and Jim Joyce still was an absolute puddle of emotions. He had just completely liquefied. And Jim, who, of course, earlier had to go out and scream at Joyce at first base after the call was missed, he owed that to his pitcher, now is the guy consoling the umpire. So you can imagine why, for me that night, and then the next day, and you brought it up, Louis, Jim said before the game, he said, would you think this is corny if I had Galarraga take the lineup card out there? And I said, I only speak for myself. I said, I think it's a masterstroke. I think it'll really help heal. And I think of course, Jim was of that opinion and did that. And it became, again, as you said, part of this redemptive story. It was unlike anything I've ever seen in sports. So that's why, even though there are a lot of close seconds and thirds and fourths and fifths and on, I had to pick that night as probably number one.
And further to add on to that, what I love about that is this kind of, I mean, it is a cliche, but there's a lot of people that say you can learn a lot about life through the game of baseball. The object is coming home safe, whatever connotations that has for anybody. But I guess the moral story of that, event that night in Detroit is this concept of forgiveness. And the fact that Galarraga was able to forgive, what could have been a very special night for him and the 40,000 plus who were in Comerica Park that night to witness that. It's this idea of you don't want to hold on to anything. And, for somebody who's playing on national television, to have that happen to him, to be able to forgive and forget, and I'm sure, forget is used in loose terms. He'll probably never forget it. But to forgive Joyce and put it past him is something that I guess we can all aspire to do, regardless, because a lot of what happens to us in our own lives, nothing may never be as big as that, given the circumstances.
No, the injured became the consolers that night and the next day. And that's why, for me, again, it had all of the particular nuts and bolts of, let's say, a gospel story almost for me. It was a powerfully spiritual event as much as it was a sporting event, and particularly, of course, at its base, it was a human event. And all of those subtexts came into a kind of cohesion that evening, and that's why, for me, after 45 years, it still stood number one.
All right, Louis has another question he wants to ask, and if we need to talk about baseball another time, we can do it, but I figure this is a good opportunity for him to speak with somebody that's well-respected in this.
Sure.
So, I'm sure you've probably already gotten through, what I've spoken to you about briefly. baseball is my favorite sport. It's the one I exude the most passion for. And, my primary aspirations are to be a national baseball writer. I aspire to be like